Munich by Robert Harris. Read by Matthew Jones. Day 1. Shortly before 1 o'clock on the afternoon of Tuesday the 27th of September 1938, Mr. Hugh Leggett of His Majesty's Diplomatic Service was shown to his table beside one of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ritz restaurant in London, ordered half a bottle of 1921 Dom Perignon he could not afford, folded his copy of the Times to page 17, and began to read for the third time the speech that had been delivered the night before in Berlin's Sportpalast by Adolf Hitler. Herr Hitler's speech. Final word to Prague. Peace or war? Occasionally Leggett glanced across the dining room to check the entrance. Perhaps it was his imagination, but it seemed that the guests and even the waiters moving back and forth across the carpet between the dusky pink upholstered chairs were unusually subdued. There was no laughter. Soundlessly beyond the thick plate glass, 40 or 50 workmen, some stripped to the waist in the humid weather, were digging slit trenches in Green Park. There should remain no doubt for the whole world at this time that it is not one man or one leader who speaks, but the whole German people. I know that in this hour the whole people, millions strong, agree with every one of my words. Heil! He had listened to it on the BBC as it was delivered. Metallic, remorseless, threatening, self-pitying, boastful. Impressive in its horrible way. It had been punctuated by the thumps of Hitler's hand pounding the podium, and by the roar of 15,000 voices shouting their approval. The noise was inhuman, unearthly. It had seemed to well up from some black subterranean river and pour out of a loudspeaker. I am grateful to Mr. Chamberlain for all his efforts, and I have assured him that the German people want nothing but peace. I have further assured him, and I emphasize it now, that when this problem is solved, Germany has no more territorial problems in Europe. Leggett took out his fountain pen and underlined the passage, and then did the same with another earlier reference to the Anglo-German naval agreement. Such an agreement is only morally justified if both nations promise one another solemnly never to wage war against one another again. Germany has this will. Let us all hope that those who are of the same conviction will gain the upper hand among the British people. He put aside the paper and checked his pocket-watch. It was characteristic of him not to carry the time on his wrist, like most men of his age, but rather on the end of a chain. He was only 28, yet seemed older. His face pale, his manner grave, his suit dark. He had made the reservation a fortnight ago, before the crisis had blown up. Now he felt guilty. He would give her another 5 minutes, then he would have to leave. It was 1:15 when he glimpsed her reflection between the flowers in the wall of gilded mirrors. She was standing on the edge of the restaurant, practically on tiptoe, peering around blankly, her long white neck extended, her chin tilted upwards. He studied her for a few moments as if she were a stranger, and wondered what on earth he would make of her if she was not his wife. A striking figure. That was the sort of thing people said of her. Not pretty exactly, no, but handsome. Pamela's what one calls a thoroughbred. Yes, tremendous breeding, and entirely out of poor Hugh's league. This latter he had overheard at the party to celebrate their engagement. He raised his hand. He stood. Finally she noticed him, smiled and waved and moved towards him, cutting quickly between the tables in her tight skirt and tailored silk jacket, leaving a wake of turned heads. She kissed him firmly on the mouth. She was slightly out of breath. Sorry. Doesn't matter, I've only just arrived. Over the past 12 months he'd learned not to ask where she'd been. As well as her handbag, she was carrying a small cardboard box. She placed it on the table in front of him and pulled off her gloves. I thought we agreed no presents. He lifted the lid. A black rubber skull, a metal snout, and the vacant glassy eye sockets of a gas mask stared back up at him. He recoiled. I took the children for fitting. Apparently I'm to put theirs on first. That will test one's marital devotion, don't you think? She lit a cigarette. "Could I have a drink? I'm parched." He signalled to the waiter. "Only half a bottle?" "I have to work this afternoon." "Of course you do. I wasn't sure you'd even show." "And I ought not to have done, to be honest. I tried to call you, but you weren't at home." "Well, now you know where I was. A perfectly innocent explanation." She smiled and leaned towards him. They clinked glasses. "Happy anniversary, darling." In the park, the workmen swung their picks. She ordered quickly without even looking at the menu. No starter, Dover sole off the bone, green salad. Leggett handed back the menu and said he'd have the same. He couldn't think about food, couldn't rid his mind of the image of his children wearing gas masks. John was 3, Diana 2. All that cautioning of them not to run too fast, to wrap up warm, not to suck toys or crayons because you never knew where they might have been. He put the box under the table and pushed it out of sight with his foot. Were they very frightened? Of course not. They thought the whole thing was a game. Do you know, sometimes I feel exactly that. Even if you see the telegrams, it's difficult not to think it's some ghastly joke. A week ago it looked as though it had all been fixed. Then Hitler changed his mind. What'll happen now? Who can say? Possibly nothing. He felt he should try to sound optimistic. They're still talking in Berlin. At least they were when I left the office. And if they stop talking, when will it start? He showed her the headline in the Times and shrugged. I suppose tomorrow. Really? As soon as that? He says he'll cross the Czech border on Saturday. Our military experts reckon it'll take him 3 days to get his tanks and artillery in position. So that means he'll have to mobilise tomorrow. He tossed the paper back on the table and drank some champagne. It tasted like acid in his mouth. I tell you what, let's change the subject. From his jacket pocket he produced a ring box. Oh, Hugh! It'll be too big. Oh, but it's charming. She slipped the ring onto her finger, held up her hand, and turned it back and forth beneath the chandelier, so that the blue stone glinted in the light. You are a wonder. I thought we hadn't any money. We haven't. It was my mother's. He'd been afraid she might think him cheap, but to his surprise she reached her hand across the table and laid it on his. You are sweet. Ah, her skin was cool. Her slim forefinger stroked his wrist. I wish we could take a room, he said suddenly, and stay in bed all afternoon. Forget about Hitler, forget about the children. Why don't you see if you can arrange it? We're here. What's to stop us? She held his gaze with her large grey-blue eyes, and he saw, with a sudden insight that caught him in his throat, that she was only saying it because she knew it would never happen. Mr. Leggett, a man behind him, coughed politely. Pamela took away her hand. He turned to find the maitre d', palms pressed together as in prayer, grave with self-importance. Yes? Number 10 Downing Street. We're on the line for you, sir. He was careful to say it just loudly enough for the neighbouring tables to hear. Hell! Leggett stood and threw down his napkin. Will you excuse me? I'll have to take it. I understand. You go and save the world. She waved him on his way. We can have lunch any time. She started packing her things into her handbag. Oh, just give me a minute. There was a pleading edge to his voice. We really have to talk. Go! He hovered for a moment, conscious of the nearby diners staring at him. Do wait, he said. He assumed what he hoped was a neutral expression and followed the maitre d' out of the restaurant and into the lobby. I thought you'd like some privacy, sir. The maitre d' opened a door to a small office. On the desk was a telephone, a handset beside it. Thank you. He picked up the receiver and waited until the door had closed before he spoke. Leggett? Sorry, Hugh. He recognised the voice of Cecil Sears, one of his colleagues in the private office. I'm afraid you're going to have to come back right away. It's about to get rather hectic. Cleverly is asking for you. Has something happened? There was a hesitation on the other end. The private secretaries were told always to assume the operator was listening in. It looks as though the talking's over. Our man is flying home. Understood. I'm on my way. He replaced the receiver on its cradle. For a moment he stood paralysed. Was this what history felt like? Germany would attack Czechoslovakia. France would declare war on Germany. Britain would support France. His children would wear gas masks. The diners at the Ritz would abandon their white linen tablecloths to crouch in slit trenches in Green Park. It was all too much to grasp. He opened the door and hurried back across the lobby into the restaurant. But such was the efficiency of the Ritz staff, their table was already cleared. In Piccadilly there was not a taxi to be had. He danced back and forth in the gutter, vainly waving his rolled-up newspaper at every passing cab. Finally he gave up, rounded the corner into St. James's Street, and set off down the hill. From time to time he glanced across the road in the hope he might see his wife. Where had she gone in such a hurry? If she was walking straight home to Westminster, this was the direction she would have to take. Best not to think of it. Best never to think of it. Already he was sweating in the unseasonable heat. Beneath his old-fashioned three-piece suit he could feel his shirt sticking to his back. Yet the sky was dull, threatening a rain that somehow never came. And all along Pall Mall, behind the tall windows of the great London clubs, the Royal Automobile, the Reform, the Athenaeum, the chandeliers glittered in the humid gloom. He did not slacken his pace until he reached the top of the steps leading down from Carlton House Terrace to St. James's Park. Here he found his path blocked by a silent crowd of 20, watching what looked like a small airship rising slowly behind the Houses of Parliament. It ascended past the spire of Big Ben, an oddly beautiful sight, majestic, surreal. In the distance he could make out half a dozen others in the sky south of the Thames, tiny silver torpedoes, some already thousands of feet high. The man beside him murmured, "I suppose you could say the balloon's gone up." Leggett glanced at him. He remembered his father using exactly the same expression when he was home on leave during the Great War. He had to go back to France because the balloon had gone up. To Hugh's 60-year-old ears it had sounded as if he was going to a party. It was the last time he'd seen him. He edged his way round the spectators, trotted down the 3 wide flights of steps, across the Mall and into Horse Guards Road. And here, in the centre of the sandy expanse of the parade ground, in the half-hour since he left, something else had happened. A pair of anti-aircraft guns had appeared. Soldiers were unloading sandbags from a flatbed lorry, working quickly, as if they feared the Luftwaffe might appear at any moment. They passed them from hand to hand along a human chain. A half-built wall of sandbags surrounded a searchlight battery. A gunner furiously turned a wheel. One of the barrels swung round and elevated until it was almost perpendicular. Leggett took out a large white cotton handkerchief and wiped his face. It would not do to turn up red-faced and perspiring. If there was one sin that was frowned upon above all others in the private office, it was appearing to be in a flap. He climbed the steps into the narrow, shadowed, soot-blackened cutting of Downing Street. On the pavement opposite number 10, a group of reporters turned their heads to follow his arrival. A photographer raised his camera, but when he saw it was no one of importance, he lowered it again. Leggett nodded to the policeman, who rapped once, hard with a knocker. The door opened of its own volition. He stepped inside. It was 4 months since he'd been seconded from a Foreign Office to work in number 10, yet each time he felt the same sensation, as if he were entering some gentleman's club that was no longer fashionable. The black and white tiled lobby, the walls of Pamanian red, the brass lantern, the grandfather clock ticking its leisurely heartbeat, the cast-iron umbrella stand with its solitary black umbrella. Somewhere in the depths of the building a telephone rang. The doorkeeper wished Leggett a good afternoon and returned to his leather coachman's seat and his copy of the Evening Standard. In the wide passageway leading to the back of the building, Leggett paused and checked himself in the mirror. He straightened his tie and smoothed down his hair with both hands. He braced his shoulders, turned. Ahead of him was the cabinet room, its panelled door closed. To his left, the office used by Sir Horace Wilson, also closed. To his right, the corridor that led to the offices of the Prime Minister's private secretaries. The Georgian house exuded an air of imperturbable calm. Miss Watson, with whom he shared the smallest office, was bent over her desk exactly as he had left her, walled in by piles of folders. Only the top of her grey head was visible. She'd begun her career as a typist when Lloyd George was Prime Minister. He was said to have chased the Downing Street girls around the cabinet table. It was hard to imagine him chasing Miss Watson. Her responsibility was preparing answers for parliamentary questions. She peered at Leggett over her barricade of the PM. "No, he's in his office. The PM's in the cabinet room with the big three." Leggett made a noise that was between a sigh and a groan. Halfway along the corridor, he stuck his head into Sears' office. "All right, Cecil, how much trouble am I in?" Sears swung round in his chair. He was a small man, 7 years Leggett's senior, constantly and irrepressibly and often, irritatingly, amused. He wore the same college tie as Leggett. "I'm afraid you picked the wrong day for your romantic lunch, old fellow. I hope you didn't take it too badly." Once in a weak moment Leggett told Sears of his difficulties at home. He'd regretted this. "Not at all. What happened in Berlin?" "Apparently it degenerated into one of Herr Hitler's tirades." Sears pretended to strike the arm of his chair. "Ich werde die Tschechen zerschlagen." "Oh, good grief. I will smash the Czechs." A military voice called along the corridor. "Ah, Leggett, there you are." Sears mouthed, "Good luck." Leggett stepped backwards and turned to confront the long moustached face of Osmond Somers Cleverly, universally known for reasons unexplained as Oscar. The Prime Minister's principal private secretary crooked a finger. Leggett followed him into his office. "I must say I'm disappointed in you, Leggett, and more than a little surprised." Cleverly was older than the rest of them, had been a soldier by profession before the war. Lunch at the Ritz in the middle of an international crisis. It may be the way things are done in the Foreign Office. It's not how we do them here. "I apologise, sir. It won't happen again." "You have no explanation?" "It was my wedding anniversary. I couldn't get hold of my wife to cancel the table." Cleverly stared at him for a few seconds longer. He did not bother to hide his suspicions of these brilliant young men from the Treasury and the Foreign Office who had never served in uniform. "There are times when one's family has to take a back seat. Now is such a time." "There are times when one's family has to take a back seat. Now is such a time." The principal private secretary sat behind his desk and switched on a lamp. This part of the house faced north across the Downing Street garden. The unpruned trees that screened it from Horse Guards parade cast the ground floor in a perpetual twilight. "Has Sears filled you in?" "Yes, sir. I gather talks have broken down. Hitler has announced his intention to mobilise at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. I'm afraid all hell is about to break loose. Sir Horace should be back to report to the PM by 5. The PM will broadcast to the nation at 8. I'd like you to deal with the BBC. They are to set up their apparatus in the cabinet room." "Yes, sir. There will have to be a full cabinet meeting at some stage, probably after the broadcast. Therefore, the BBC engineers will need to clear out quickly. The PM will also be seeing the Dominion High Commissioners. Chiefs of Staff are due to arrive at any minute. Take them into the PM as soon as they all get here, and I shall need you to take a note of the meeting so that the PM can brief the Cabinet." "Yes, sir." "Parliament is being recalled, as you know. He intends to make a statement of the House on the crisis tomorrow afternoon. Have all the relevant minutes and telegrams for the past 2 weeks been arranged for him in chronological order?" "Yes, sir." "I'm afraid you'll probably have to stay overnight." A phantom of a smile played beneath Cleverly's moustache. He reminded Leggett of a muscular Christian games master at a minor public school. "It's a pity it's your anniversary, but it can't be helped. I'm sure your wife will understand. You can sleep in the duty clerk's room on the 3rd floor. Is that all?" "That is all, for now." Cleverly put on his spectacles and began studying a document. Leggett walked back to his office and sat down heavily at his desk. He opened a drawer, took out a pot of ink, and dipped in his pen. He was not used to being reprimanded. "Damn Cleverly," he thought. His hand shook slightly, rattling his nib against the glass edge of the pot. Miss Wilson sighed, but did not look up. He reached into the wire basket on the left of his desk and took out a folder of telegrams recently arrived from the Foreign Office. Before he could untie the pink ribbon, Sergeant Wren, the Downing Street messenger, appeared in the doorway. As usual, he was out of breath. He had lost a leg in the war. "The Chief of the Imperial General Staff's here, sir." Leggett followed him as he limped down the passage towards the lobby. In the distance, under a brass lantern, stood Viscount Gort, reading a telegram, his polished brown boots planted wide apart. A glamorous figure, an aristocrat, a war hero. a holder of a Victorian cross. Gort seemed oblivious to the clerks and secretaries and typists who had suddenly discovered pressing reasons to cross the lobby in order to catch a glimpse of him. The front door opened onto a cascade of flashes from a photographer's cameras, out of which stepped Air Marshal Newell, followed seconds later by the towering figure of the First Sea Lord, Admiral Backhouse. Leggett said, "If you'd kindly come with me, gentlemen." As he led them down the interior, he heard Gort say, "Is Duff coming?" and Backhouse reply, "No, the PM thinks he leaks to Winston. Would you mind waiting here a moment?" The cabinet room was soundproofed by double doors. He opened the outer and knocked gently on the inner. The Prime Minister was seated with his back to the door. Facing him across the centre of the long table were Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, Simon, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Home Secretary, Hoare. All three looked up to see who had come in. The room was in absolute silence apart from the ticking of the clock. "Excuse me, Prime Minister, the Chiefs of Staff are here." Chamberlain did not turn. His hands were on the table, spread wide on either side of him, as if he were about to push back his chair. His forefingers slowly tapped the polished surface. Eventually, in his precise, slightly old-maidish voice, he said, "Very well. Let us meet again when Horace returns. We'll hear what more he has to say then." The ministers gathered up their papers, awkwardly in the case of Halifax, whose withered left arm hung uselessly at his side. They rose to their feet without saying a word. They were men in their 50s or 60s, the big three in the prime of their power, bulked by their dignity beyond their physical size. Leggett stood aside to let them pass. Like a trio of pallbearers in search of their coffin, was how he described them afterwards to seers. He heard them greet the service chiefs waiting outside, hushed, grim voices. He said quietly, "Would you like me to show in the Chiefs of Staff now, Prime Minister?" Still Chamberlain did not look at him. He was staring at the opposite wall. His corvine profile was hard, stubborn, belligerent even. Eventually he said distractedly, "Yes, of course, yes, bring them in." Leggett stationed himself at the far end of the cabinet table, close to the Doric pillars that supported the ceiling. The bookcases showed the spines of brown, leather-bound statutes and silvery blue editions of Hansard. The Chiefs of Staff placed their caps on the side table by the door and took the seats vacated by the ministers. Gort, as the senior officer, occupied the central position. They opened their briefcases and spread out their papers. All three lit cigarettes. Leggett glanced across at the mantel clock over the fireplace behind the Prime Minister's head. He dipped his nib into the nearby inkstand. On a foolscap sheet he wrote, PM and C of S, 2:05 PM. Chamberlain cleared his throat. "Well, gentlemen, I'm afraid the situation has deteriorated. We had hoped for, and the Czech government had agreed to, the orderly transfer of the Sudeten territory to Germany, subject to a plebiscite. Unfortunately, Herr Hitler announced last night he was not prepared to wait even so much as a week longer, and will invade on Saturday. Horace Wilson saw him this morning and warned him privately but very firmly that if France fulfills her treaty obligations to Czechoslovakia, which we still have every reason to believe she will, then we shall be obliged to support France." The Prime Minister put on his spectacles and picked up a telegram. After his customary ranting and raving, Herr Hitler responded, according to our ambassador in Berlin, in the following terms. "If France and England strike, let them do so. It is a matter of complete indifference to me. I am prepared for every eventuality. I can only take note of the position. It is Tuesday today, and by next Monday we shall be at war." Chamberlain put down the telegram and took a sip of water. Leggett's pen ran rapidly over the heavy paper. PM, latest from Berlin. Breakdown of talks. Violent reaction by Herr Hitler. Next week we will be at war. I shall, of course, continue my efforts to find a peaceful solution, if one exists, although it's hard at the moment to see what more can be done. But in the meantime, I fear we must prepare for the worst. Gort looked at each of his colleagues. Prime Minister, we have drawn up a memorandum. It summarizes our collective view of the military situation. Perhaps I might read out our conclusion. Chamberlain nodded. It's our opinion that no pressure that Great Britain and France can bring to bear, either by sea, on land, or in the air, could prevent Germany from overrunning Bohemia and from inflicting a decisive defeat on Czechoslovakia. The restoration of Czechoslovakia's lost integrity could only be achieved by the defeat of Germany, and as the outcome of a prolonged struggle, which from the outset must assume the character of an unlimited war. Nobody spoke. Leggett was acutely conscious of the scratching of his nib. Suddenly it sounded absurdly loud. "This is the nightmare I have always dreaded," said Chamberlain. "It is as if we've learned nothing from the last war and are reliving August 1914. One by one the countries of the world will be dragged in, and for what? We've already told the Czechs that once we've won, its nation in the present form cannot continue to exist. The 3.5 million Sudeten Germans must have the right of self-determination. Therefore the separation of the Sudetenland from Germany will not even be an Allied war aim. So for what would we be fighting? For the rule of law?" suggested Gort. "For the rule of law. Indeed. And if it comes to it, we shall. But by God, I wish we could find some other way of upholding it." The Prime Minister briefly touched his hand to his forehead. His old-fashioned winged collar drew attention to his sinewy neck. His face was grey with exhaustion. But with an effort he recovered his usual business-like manner. "What practical steps now need to be taken?" "We shall send 2 divisions to France immediately, as we have already agreed, to demonstrate our solidarity. They can be in position within 3 weeks, and ready to fight 18 days after that. But General Gamelin has made it quite clear the French have no intention of mounting anything more than token raids on Germany until next summer. Frankly, I doubt they'll even do that. They'll stay behind the Maginot Line." Newell added, "They're waiting until we arrive in greater strength. And is the Air Force ready?" Newell was sitting up very straight, a thin-faced man, skeletal almost, with a small grey moustache. "I have to say this comes at the worst possible time for us, Prime Minister. On paper, we've 26 squadrons available for home defence, but only 6 have modern aircraft. 1 has Spitfires, the other 5 have Hurricanes." "But are they ready to fight?" "Some are. Some? I'm afraid there's a technical problem with the guns on the Hurricanes, Prime Minister. They freeze above 15,000 feet. "What's that you're saying?" Chamberlain leant forward as though he'd not heard correctly. "We're working on a solution, but it may take some time." "No, what you're actually saying, Air Marshal, is that we have spent £1,500 million on rearmament, the bulk of it in the air, and when it comes to it, our warplanes don't work. Our planning has always been predicted on there being no conflict with Germany before 1939, at the earliest." The Prime Minister turned his attention back to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. "Lord Gort, can't the army shoot down most of the attacking aircraft from the ground?" "I'm afraid we're in a similar position to the Air Chief Marshal, Prime Minister. We only have about 1/3 of the number of guns we believe are necessary to defend London, and most of those are obsolete relics from the last war. We are equally short of searchlights. We have no ranging or communication equipment. We were also counting on another year to prepare." Halfway through his answer, Chamberlain seemed to have stopped listening. He had put on his spectacles again and was sorting through his papers. The atmosphere in the room had become uncomfortable. Leggett continued writing calmly, smoothing the awkward facts into bureaucratic prose. PM expressed concern at adequacy of home air defence, but the orderly mechanism of his mind was disturbed. Once again he couldn't escape the image of his children in gas masks. Chamberlain had found what he was looking for. "The Joint Intelligence Committee estimates there will be 150,000 casualties in London by the end of the first week of bombing, 600,000 by the end of 2 months. That's unlikely to happen immediately. We assume that to begin with the Germans will direct their principal bombing against the Czechs." "And when the Czechs have been defeated, then what?" "Then we don't know. We should certainly use the time available to make precautions, and start evacuating London tomorrow." "And how prepared is the Navy?" The First Sea Lord was a striking presence, a good head taller than anyone else in the room. His grizzled skull was bald, his face deeply scoured, as if it had been exposed to the elements too long. "We have some shortages of escort vessels and minesweepers. Our capital ships require fueling and arming. Some of the crews are on leave. We shall need to announce mobilization as quickly as possible." "When would you need to do that? To be operational by the 1st of October?" "Today." Chamberlain sat back in his chair. His forefingers tapped the table. Of course, that would mean we would mobilize before Germany. Partially mobilize, Prime Minister, and there is something else to be said for it. It would have the effect of showing Hitler we aren't bluffing, that if it comes to it, we are prepared to fight. It might even make him think twice. It might. Or it might push him into war. Remember, I have stared into that man's eyes on 2 occasions now, and in my judgment, if there is one thing he cannot tolerate, it is losing face. But surely, if we're going to fight, it's important he should be left in no doubt of that fact. It would be a tragedy if he interpreted your courageous visits and your sincere efforts for peace as a sign of weakness. Wasn't that the mistake the Germans made in 1914? They thought we weren't serious. Chamberlain folded his arms and stared at the table. Leggett couldn't tell whether the gesture meant he'd rejected the suggestion or was considering it. Shrewd of Backhouse to flatter him, he thought. The Prime Minister had few obvious weaknesses, but strangely for such a shy man, his besetting vice was vanity. The seconds ticked by. Finally he looked up at Backhouse and nodded. Very well. Mobilize. The First Sea Lord stubbed out his cigarette and stuffed his papers into his briefcase. Then I'd better get back to the Admiralty. The others rose with him, grateful to escape. Chamberlain called up to them. I would like you to hold yourselves in readiness to brief senior ministers later today. In the meantime, we should avoid doing or saying anything that contributes to a mood of public panic, or forces Hitler into a position from which he cannot back down, even at the 11th hour. After the chiefs of staff had gone, Chamberlain let out a long sigh and rested his head in his hand. Glancing sideways, he seemed to notice Leggett for the first time. Were you making a note of all that? Yes, Prime Minister. Destroy it. Chapter 2. In Wilhelmstrasse, in the heart of the government sector of Berlin, in the sprawling 3-storey 19th-century building that housed the German Foreign Ministry, Paul von Hartmann was contemplating a telegram that had come in overnight from London. It said, Confidential, London, 26th of September, 1938. In the name of our old friendship and our common desire for peace between our peoples, I do urge your Excellency to use your influence to postpone the decisive movement of October 1st to a later date, that time may be given to allay present passions and provide opportunities for reaching adjustment of details. Rothermere, 14 Stratton House, Piccadilly, London. Hartmann lit a cigarette and considered what sort of response was required. In the 7 months since Ribbentrop had taken over as Foreign Minister, he had been called upon many times to translate incoming messages from English into German, and then to draft replies in the Minister's name. At first he'd adopted the traditional, formal, neutral tone of a professional diplomat, but many of his early efforts had been rejected as insufficiently National Socialist. Some had even been returned to him by SS Sturmbannführer Sauer of Ribbentrop's staff, with a thick black line scrawled through them. He'd been forced to recognise that if his career was to prosper, a certain adjustment of style would be necessary. Gradually, therefore, he had trained himself to mimic the minister's bombastic manner and radical world-view, and it was in this spirit that he set to work answering the owner of the Daily Mail, his pen scraping and stabbing at the paper as he worked himself into a state of faux outrage. His concluding paragraph, in particular, struck him as masterly. The idea that because of the Sudeten problem, which is completely secondary to England, peace might be destroyed between our two peoples seems to me madness and a crime against humanity. Germany has pursued an honest policy of understanding with England. It desires peace and friendship with England. But when foreign Bolshevist influences have come to the fore in English politics, Germany must be prepared for every eventuality. The responsibility before the world for such a crime would not fall to Germany, as you, my dear Lord Rothermere, know better than anyone. He blew on the ink. Really, with Ribbentrop, one could never lay it on too thick. Hartmann lit another cigarette. He started again from the beginning, making small corrections here and there, squinting at the paper through his smoke. His forehead was high. His hairline, even at the age of 29, had already receded almost to the crown. His mouth was wide and voluptuous, his nose strong. It was a mobile and expressive face, compelling, unusual, almost ugly, and yet his genius was for making men and women love him. He was about to place his draft in the basket to be sent to the typists when he heard a noise, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say he felt a noise. It seemed to travel through the soles of his shoes and up the legs of his chair. The pages in his hands shook. The rumble intensified, became a roar, and for a ludicrous moment he wondered if the city was experiencing an earthquake. But then his ear picked out the distinctive note of heavy engines revving and the clank of metal tracks. The two men with whom he shared his office, von Nostitz and von Ratzau, glanced at one another and frowned. They got to their feet and went over to the window. Hartmann joined them. A column of drab olive-green armoured vehicles was trundling south down Wilhelmstrasse from the direction of Unter den Linden. Artillery half-trucks, panzers on the backs of tank transporters, heavy guns towed by trucks and by teams of horses. Hartmann craned his neck. It went on for as far as he could see, a full motorized division to judge by the length of it. Von Nostitz, who was older than Hartmann and one grade higher, said, "My God, is it already starting?" Hartmann went back to his desk, picked up his telephone and dialed an extension. He had to cover his left ear with his hand to shut out the noise. A metallic voice at the other end said, "Kurt?" "It's Paul. What's happening?" "Meet me downstairs." Kurt rang off. Hartmann took his hat from the stand. Von Nostitz said mockingly, "Are you going to join them?" "No. Obviously I am going outside to cheer our gallant Weltmach." He hurried along the high, gloomy corridor, down the central staircase and through the double doors. A short flight of steps, blue-carpeted in the centre and flanked by a pair of stone sphinxes, led to the entrance hall. To Hartmann's surprise, the lobby was deserted, even though the air itself seemed to be vibrating with the noise from outside. Kurt joined him a minute later, his briefcase wedged under his arm. He'd taken off his spectacles and was breathing on the lenses, polishing them on the thick end of his tie. Together they went out into the street. Only a handful of Foreign Ministry staff had gathered on the pavement to watch. Across the road, of course, it was a different story. In the Propaganda Ministry they were all practically hanging out of the windows. The sky was overcast, yearning to rain. Hartmann felt a drop of moisture on his cheek. Kurt took him by the arm, and together they walked in the same direction as the column. A score of red, white and black swastika banners hung motionless above their heads. They gave the grey stone facade of the ministry a festive air, but it was striking how few people were lingering on the street. Nobody was waving or cheering. Mostly they had their heads down or were staring fixedly ahead. Hartmann wondered what had gone wrong. Normally the party stage managed these things much better. Kurt had yet to speak. The Rhinelander was taking quick, nervous steps. About 2/3 of the way down the length of the building, he steered them into an unused entrance. The heavy wooden door was permanently barred. The porch offered privacy from prying eyes. Not that there was much to see. Just the head of a foreign minister's private office, a harmless, bespectacled, clerkish figure, and a tall young legation secretary holding an impromptu meeting. Kurt clasped his briefcase to his chest, undid the catch, and drew out a typewritten document. He gave it to Hartmann. 6 pages typed in the extra-large characters the Führer preferred, to spare his far-seeing eyes whenever he had to deal with bureaucratic trivia. It was an account of his meeting that morning with Sir Horace Wilson, written up by the Foreign Ministry's chief interpreter, Dr. Schmidt. Couched in the blandished official language, Hartmann could nevertheless visualize what it described as vividly as if it were a scene in a novel. The obsequious Wilson had congratulated the Führer on the warm reception of his speech at the Sportpalast the previous evening, as if anything else was possible, had thanked him for his kind references to Prime Minister Chamberlain, and, at one point, had asked the others present, Ribbentrop, together with Ambassador Henderson and First Secretary Kirkpatrick of the British Embassy, to step out of the room briefly so that he could assure Hitler in private, man to man, that London would continue to put pressure on the Czechs. Schmidt had even recorded his words in the original English. "I will try to make those Czechos sensible." But none of that could disguise the central fact of the encounter, that Wilson had had the temerity to read out a prepared statement declaring that in the event of hostilities the British would support the French, and had then asked the Führer to repeat back what he had just told him, to be sure there was no misunderstanding. Little wonder Hitler had lost his temper and told Wilson he didn't care what the French or British did, that he'd spent billions preparing for war, and if war was what they wanted, then war was what they would get. Hartmann thought it was like watching an unarmed passer-by trying to persuade a madman to hand over his gun. So it will be war after all. He returned the document to Court, who locked it back in his briefcase. It appears to be the case. Half an hour after the meeting ended, Court nodded towards the armoured column, the Führer ordered this. It's no accident it's driving straight past the British embassy. The noise of the engines split the warm air. Hartmann could taste the dust and sweetness of the fuel on his tongue. He had to shout over the noise. Who are they? Where are they from? Witzlebin's men from the Berlin garrison, heading to the Czech frontier. Behind his back, Hartmann clenched his fist. At last, he felt a rush of anticipation. So now you must agree. There is no alternative, yes? We must act. Court nodded slowly. I feel like I'm going to be sick. Suddenly he put a warning hand on Hartmann's arm. A policeman was walking towards them, his truncheon drawn. Gentlemen, good afternoon. The Führer's on the balcony. He gestured with his truncheon further along the street. His manner was respectful, encouraging. He was not telling them what to do, merely alerting them to an historic opportunity. Thank you, officer, Court said. The two diplomats stepped back into the street. The Reich Chancellery stood next to the Foreign Ministry. Across the road in Wilhelmplatz, a small crowd had gathered in the broad expanse of the square. This was unquestionably a party clique. Even some wore swastika armbands. From time to time a ragged shout of Heil went up, and arms were raised in salute. The men in the armoured column swivelled their heads, eyes right, and saluted. Young men mostly, far younger than Hartmann. He was close enough to see their expressions. Amazement, wonder, pride. Beyond the high black iron railings of the Reich Chancellery was a courtyard. Above the main entrance to the building a balcony. On the balcony the unmistakable lone figure, brown jacket, brown cap, left hand clutching the buckle of his black belt, the right arm occasionally flashing out, robotic in its absolute steadiness, palm flat, fingers extended. He couldn't have been more than 50 metres away. Court saluted and muttered, Heil Hitler! Hartmann did the same. Once it was past the Chancellery, the column accelerated towards Buchenplatz. Hartmann said, How many people would you say turned out to watch? Court scanned the few groups of spectators. I'd say no more than 200. He won't like that. No, he won't. For once I do believe the regime has made a mistake. The Führer was so flattered by Chamberlain's visits, he let Goebbels tell the media to go to town. The German people thought they were going to get peace. Now they're told they're going to get war after all. They don't like it. So when are we going to act? Surely this has to be the time. Oster wants to meet tonight. A new place. Number 9 Goethestrasse, in Lichterfeld. Lichterfeld? Why does he want us to meet all the way out there? Who knows? Arrive as close to 10 as you can. It's going to be a busy evening. Court clasped Hartmann's shoulder briefly, then walked away. Hartmann stood for a while longer, his eyes trained on the figure on the balcony. Security was astonishingly light. A couple of policemen at the entrance to the courtyard, 2 SS men on the door. There would be more inside, but even so. Of course, once war was declared, it would be a different matter. Then they would never get anywhere near him. After a couple more minutes, the figure on the balcony seemed to have had enough. He dropped his arm, peered up and down Wilhelmstrasse like the manager of a theatre praising the disappointing size of a night's audience, turned his back and stepped through the curtains into the Chancellery. The door closed. Hartmann took off his hat and flattened his thinning hair, then pulled down the brim once more, and walked back thoughtfully in the direction of his office. At 6 p.m. precisely, the tolling of Big Ben carried into number 10 through the open windows. As if on cue, Miss Watson stood, collected her hat and coat, wished Leggett a crisp good evening, and left the office, carrying one of the Prime Minister's red dispatch boxes filled to the brim with her carefully annotated files. The recall of Parliament for an emergency debate on the Czech crisis had put an end to her leisurely summer. Leggett knew she would now bicycle, as she always did, down Whitehall to the Palace of Westminster, leave her ancient machine in New Place Yard, and walk up a private staircase to the Prime Minister's office, which lay across the corridor behind the Speaker's chair. There she would meet Mr. Chamberlain's parliamentary private secretary, Lord Dunglass, upon whom she had an obvious and unrequited crush. This in order to discuss answers for PM's written questions. This was Leggett's chance. He closed the door, sat at his desk, picked up the telephone and called the switchboard. He tried to make his tone casual. "Good evening, Leggett here. Could you please put me through to this number? Victoria 7472. From the instant the meeting with the Chiefs of Staff had ended, until that very moment, Leggett had been fully occupied. Now at last he laid his notes down on the desk. Trained since childhood for the gladiatorial combat of the examination hall, school, scholarship, Oxford finals, Foreign Office entrance, he had written on only one side of the paper to avoid smuggling the ink. MP expressed concern at adequacy of home air defence. Quickly he turned the foolscap sheets over so that the blank side was uppermost. As ordered, he would destroy them. But not quite yet. Something was preventing him. He could not say precisely what. An odd sense of propriety, perhaps. All afternoon, as he had ferried in successive visitors to see the Prime Minister and compiled the documents the PM needed for his speech to Parliament, he had felt himself privy to the real truth. This was the information upon which government policy would be decided. One might almost say nothing else mattered in comparison. Diplomacy, morality, law, obligation. What did these weigh in the scales against military strength? An RAF squadron, if you remember correctly, consisted of 20 planes. So at high altitude there were only 20 modern fighters with working guns to defend the entire country. "Putting you through now, sir." There was a click as the connection was made, followed by the long double purr of the number ringing. She answered far quicker than he'd expected, and brightly. "Victoria 7472? Pamela, it's me." "Oh, hello, Hugh." She sounded surprised, and possibly also disappointed. He said, "Listen, I can't speak for long, so please concentrate on what I'm about to say. I want you to pack a week's worth of clothes and get the garage to drive you and the children to your parents right away." "But it's 6 o'clock. They'll still be open. Why do we have to go in such a rush? What's happened?" "Nothing. Nothing yet, anyway. I just want to know you're somewhere safe. It sounds rather panicky. I hate people who panic." He tightened his grip on the receiver. "But I'm afraid people are going to panic, darling." He glanced at the door. Someone was walking past. Their footsteps seemed to stop. He lowered his voice, but spoke with greater urgency. "By later tonight it may be very hard to get out of London. You need to go now while the roads are still clear. Don't argue with me, Pamela. Will you just for once do something I bloody well ask?" There was a pause. "And what about you?" "I have to stay here overnight. I'll try to call you later. I have to go now. You will do this, you promise me?" "Yes, all right, if you insist." He could hear one of the children in the background. She shushed them. "Quiet, I'm talking to your father. Do you want me to bring you an overnight bag?" "No, don't worry. I'll try and slip out at some point. You concentrate on getting out of London. I love you. You do know that." "I know." She waited. He knew he ought to say something back, but he couldn't find the words. There was a clatter as she hung up, and then all he could hear was the dialing tone. Someone knocked on the door. "Just a moment." He folded his notes from a Chiefs of Staff meeting in half, and then in half again, and slipped them into his inside pocket. In the corridor was Wren, the messenger. Leggett wondered if he'd been listening, but all he said was, "The BBC have arrived." For the first time since the crisis started, there was a large crowd in Downing Street. They had gathered quietly near the photographers on the opposite side of the street to number 10. What seemed to have attracted their attention most was a large dark green van with the BBC coat of arms and outside broadcast painted on its sides in gold lettering. It was parked just to the left of the front door. A pair of technicians was feeding cables from the back of the van across the pavement and through one of the sash windows. Leggett stood on the doorstep arguing with a young engineer whose name was Wood. "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid it's just not possible." "Well, why not?" Wood wore a V-necked pullover under a brown corduroy suit. "Because the Prime Minister will be holding meetings in the Cabinet Room until 7:30. "Well, can't he hold them somewhere else?" Don't be absurd. Well, in that case, couldn't we do the broadcast from a different room? No. He wishes to address the British people from the heart of government, and that is the Cabinet Room. Well, look, we're on air at 8, and it's gone 6 now. What if the equipment fails because we haven't tested it properly? You will have half an hour at the very least, and if I can get you any more time, I shall. He broke off. Behind Wood's shoulder, a black Austin 10 was turning from Whitehall into Downing Street. The driver had switched on the headlamps in the early evening gloom and was edging forward slowly to avoid hitting some of the onlookers who'd spilled off the pavement into the road. The newsreel cameramen recognised the passenger before Leggett did. The brilliance of their arc lights briefly blinded him. He raised his hand to shield his eyes. He muttered, "Excuse me," to Wood, and stepped down onto the pavement. As the car drew to a halt, he opened the rear door. Hunched down in his seat, Sir Horace Wilson had an umbrella between his knees and a briefcase cradled on his lap. He gave Leggett a weak smile and slid out of the car. On the step of number 10, he turned for an instant, his expression lugubrious and non-committal. The flashbulbs popped. He scuttled inside, like some nocturnal animal allergic to light. Ignoring his companion, who was emerging from the other side of the car, he advanced towards Leggett, hand outstretched. "Colonel Mason McFarlane, military attaché, Berlin." The policeman saluted. In the entrance hall, Wilson was already shedding his overcoat and hat. The Prime Minister's special adviser was a slight, almost emaciated figure, with a long nose and pendulous ears. Leggett had never found him less than polite, even on occasions slyly charming. The sort of reserved senior colleague he feared might one day unburden himself of confidences one would prefer not to hear. He'd made his reputation at the Ministry of Labour, dealing with trade union leaders. The thought that he had come straight from delivering an ultimatum to Adolf Hitler was bizarre. Nevertheless, the Prime Minister considered him indispensable. He placed his rolled umbrella carefully into the stand next to his master's and turned to Leggett. "Where's the PM?" "He's in his study, Sir Horace, working on his broadcast for tonight. Everyone else is in the Cabinet Room." Wilson set off confidently towards the back of the building. He beckoned to Mason McFarlane to follow him. "I want you to brief the PM as soon as possible." He added over his shoulder to Leggett, "Would you be kind enough to tell the PM I'm back?" He threw open the doors to the Cabinet Room and marched in. Leggett had a glimpse of dark suits and gold braid, of strained faces, and of coiling blue clouds of cigarette smoke suspended in the dusky light, and then the door was closed again. He walked down the corridor, past Cleverley's office and Sears, and his own, to the main staircase. He ascended past black and white etchings and photographs of every Prime Minister since Walpole. By the time he reached the landing, the house had metamorphosized from gentleman's club into a grand country mansion, mysteriously deposited in central London. With sofas and oil paintings and high Georgian sash windows, the vista of empty reception rooms was quiet and deserted. Beneath the thick carpet the floorboards creaked. He felt like an intruder. He knocked lightly on the door to the Prime Minister's study. "Come." The room was large and light. The Prime Minister was sitting with his back to the window, bent over his desk, writing with his right hand, a cigar burning in his left. An array of pens and pencils and inkpots stood on a little rack in front of him, alongside a pipe and tobacco jar. Apart from these and his ashtray and a leather-bound blotter, the big desk was bare. Leggett had never seen a man look lonelier. "Sir Horace Wilson has returned, Prime Minister. He's waiting to see you downstairs." As usual, Chamberlain did not look up. "Thank you. Would you mind holding on for a moment?" He paused to suck on his cigar, and then continued to write. Wreaths of smoke hung around his grey head. Leggett stepped over the threshold. In 4 months he'd never had a proper conversation with the Prime Minister. On several occasions, minutes he had submitted overnight had come back the following morning with expressions of gratitude written in the margins in red ink. "A first-rate analysis. Clearly worked out and well expressed. Thank you. N.C." And he had found himself more touched by these schoolmasterly words of praise than by any amount of the usual politician's bonhomie. But he had never been addressed by name, not even by surname, as Sears usually was, let alone by his Christian name, which was a distinction reserved for Cleverley alone. The minutes passed. Surreptitiously, Leggett took out his watch and checked it. Eventually the PM finished writing. He replaced his pen on the rack, balanced his cigar on the edge of the ashtray, and gathered together the sheets of paper. He squared them and held them up. "Would you be so good as to have these typed?" "Of course." Leggett walked over and took the pages. There were about a dozen. "You're an Oxford man, I suppose?" "Yes, Prime Minister." "You have a turn of phrase, I've noticed. Perhaps you would read it through. If you find there are passages that need amplifying, feel free to make suggestions. I have so much else on my mind. I worry that somehow it does not flow." He pushed back his chair, retrieved his cigar, and stood. The sudden movement seemed to make him dizzy. He placed his hand on the desk to steady himself, then headed for the door. On the landing, Mrs. Chamberlain was waiting. She looked as if she had already dressed for dinner in some sort of velvety gown. She was a decade younger than the Prime Minister. Kind, vague, bosomy, softly stout. She reminded Leggett of his mother-in-law, another Anglo-Irish county girl, said to have been a beauty in her youth. Leggett hung back. She said something quietly to her husband, and to his amazement he saw the Prime Minister briefly take her hand and kiss her on the lips. "I can't stop now, Annie. We'll talk later." As Leggett passed her, it looked to him as if she'd been crying. He followed Chamberlain down the stairs, noticing the narrow, sloping shoulders, the silvery hair curling slightly where it was cut short at the back, the surprisingly powerful hand brushing lightly along the banister rail with a half-smoked cigar still wedged between the second and third fingers. He saw a Victorian figure. His portrait on the staircase ought to be halfway up rather than at the top. When they reached the private office corridor, the Prime Minister said, "Please bring me the speech as soon as you can." He walked on past Leggett's office, patting his pockets until he found his box of matches. At the entrance to the cabinet room he stopped and relit his cigar, then opened the doors and disappeared inside. Wilson's office adjoined the cabinet room and was linked to it directly by its own door. Often when the Prime Minister was working alone at the long coffin-shaped table, the door was left open so that Wilson could wander in and out at will. In the press he was written up as Chamberlain's Svengali, but in Leggett's observation that was to underrate the PM's dominance. Wilson was more like a supremely useful servant. He glided silently round Downing Street, keeping an eye on the machinery of government in the manner of a store detective. Several times when he'd been working at his own desk, he'd felt a presence, and had turned to find Wilson quietly observing him from the doorway. His face would be expressionless at first, then would come that sly, unnerving smile. The BBC engineers unspooled cables across the carpet and set up a microphone at the far end of a cabinet table close to the pillars. It was suspended from a metal stand, an object large and cylindrical, tapering to a point at the back, like the sawn-off end of an artillery shell. Beside it was a loudspeaker and various other mysterious pieces of equipment. Sears and Cleverly had come in to watch. Sears said, "The BBC have asked if they can also make a live broadcast of a PM's statement to Parliament tomorrow." Cleverly said, "That's not a matter for us. It would obviously set a precedent. I've referred them to the Chief Whip." At 8 minutes, the Prime Minister emerged from Wilson's office, followed by Halifax and Cadogan. Wilson was the last to appear. He looked irritated. Leggett guessed he must have had a further argument with Cadogan. That was Wilson's other great usefulness, to act as a surrogate for his chief. The Prime Minister could use him to test out ideas, and then could sit back and observe what happened, without having to expose his own views and risk his authority. Chamberlain took his seat behind the microphone and spread out his speech. His hands were shaking. One of the pages fell to the floor, and he had to bend stiffly to retrieve it. He muttered, "I'm wobbling about all over the place." He asked for a glass of water. Leggett poured one from the jug in the centre of the table. In his anxiety he overfilled it. Beads of water stood out on the polished surface. The BBC engineer asked them all to sit at the other end of the room. Outside, over the garden and Horse Guards parade, darkness had fallen. Big Ben chimed 8 o'clock. The announcer's voice came over the loudspeaker. "This is London. In a moment you will hear the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Neville Chamberlain, speaking from number 10 Downing Street. His speech will be heard all over the Empire, throughout the continent of America, and in a large number of foreign countries. Mr. Chamberlain." Beside the microphone a green light glowed. The Prime Minister adjusted his cuffs and picked up his speech. "I want to say a few words to you, men and women of Britain and the Empire, and perhaps to others as well." He enunciated each syllable carefully. His tone was euphonious, melancholy, as inspiring as a dirge. "How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. It seems still more impossible that a quarrel which has already been settled in principle should be the subject of war. I can well understand the reasons why the Czech government have felt unable to accept the terms which have been put before them in the German memorandum. Leggett glanced across the table at Cadogan. He was nodding in agreement. Yet I believe after my talks with Herr Hitler that if only time were allowed, it ought to be possible for the arrangements for transferring the territory that the Czech government has agreed to give to Germany to be settled by agreement under conditions that would ensure fair treatment to the population concerned. After my visits to Germany, I have realized vividly how Herr Hitler feels that he must champion other Germans. He told me privately, and last night he repeated publicly, that after this Sudeten German question... Cadogan winced at Halifax, but the Foreign Secretary stared ahead. His long, pale, pious, crafty face was motionless. In the Foreign Office they called him the Holy Fox. I shall not give up the hope of a peaceful solution, or abandon my efforts for peace, as long as any chance for peace remains. I would not hesitate to pay even a third visit to Germany, if I thought it would do any good. Now it was Wilson who was nodding. Meanwhile, there are certain things we can and shall do at home. Volunteers are still wanted for air raid precautions, for fire brigade and police services, and for the territorial units. Do not be alarmed if you hear of men being called up to man the anti-aircraft defences or ships. These are only precautionary measures, such as a government must take in times like this. Legate waited for the line announcing the mobilization of the Navy, but it did not come. The Prime Minister had cut it. Instead, he had inserted a new paragraph. However much we may sympathize with a small nation confronted by a big and powerful neighbour, we cannot in all circumstances undertake to involve the whole British Empire in war, simply on her account. If we have to fight, it must be on larger issues than that. If I were convinced that any nation had made up its mind to dominate the world by fear of its force, I should feel that it must be resisted. Under such a domination, life for people who believe in liberty would not be worth living. But war is a fearful thing, and we must be very clear before we embark on it that it is really the great issues that are at stake, and that the call to risk everything in their defence, when all the consequences are weighed, is irresistible. For the present, I ask you to await as calmly as you can the events of the next few days. As long as war has not begun, there is always hope that it may be prevented, and you know that I am going to work for peace to the last moment. Good night. The green light went out. Chamberlain exhaled a long breath and slumped back in his chair. Wilson was the first on his feet. He walked towards the Prime Minister, softly applauding. It really was superb, if I may say so. Not one stumble or hesitation. Leggett had never seen the Prime Minister grin before. It bared a neat row of yellowish-grey teeth. He looked almost boyish in his pleasure at being praised. Was it really all right? Halifax said. The tone was perfect, Prime Minister. Thank you, Edward. Thank you, everyone. He included Leggett, along with the BBC engineers, in this general benediction. I always find the trick, when I'm speaking on the wireless, is to try to imagine I'm talking just to one person, sitting in their armchair, intimately, as a friend. This was harder to do tonight, of course, knowing I was also having to talk to a second person, sitting in the shadows of the room. He took a sip of water. Herr Hitler. Chapter 4. The civil servant in charge of the German Foreign Ministry, State Secretary Ernst von Weizsäcker, had announced that he wished to have a German translation of the Prime Minister's speech in his hands within 30 minutes of its delivery. He had entrusted the responsibility to Paul von Hartmann. High up in the radio monitoring room in the eaves of a Wilhelmstrasse building, beneath the huge array of radio aerials that sprouted from the roof, Hartmann had duly assembled a 3-woman team. First, the stenographer took down Chamberlain's words in English, no easy task, since by the time the BBC's signal reached Berlin it had lost much of its strength, and the Prime Minister's ethereal voice, fading in and out of the clouds of static, was often difficult to make out. As soon as each page of shorthand was filled, a second secretary typed up the notes in English, triple-spaced. Hartmann wrote down his translation beneath the lines of English text and passed the pages one by one to a third secretary, who typed up the finished German version. His pen moved rapidly over the cheap paper, the brown ink bleeding slightly into the coarse weave. 10 minutes after Chamberlain had finished speaking, the job was done. The typist tore the last page from her machine. Hartmann grabbed it, slipped the speech into a cardboard folder, kissed the top of her head, and strode out of the room, pursued by relieved laughter. The instant he was in the corridor, his smile disappeared. As he walked towards Weizsäcker's office, he flicked back and forth between the pages of the speech with increasing dismay. The tone was far too wary and conciliatory. Thin stuff, mere audio ectoplasm. Where was the threat, the ultimatum? Why hadn't Chamberlain repeated in public that evening what his emissary had told Hitler in private that morning? That if France went to the aid of Czechoslovakia, Britain would support France. He descended the stairs to the ground floor, knocked on the door of Weizsäcker's outer office, and went straight in without waiting for a reply. The room was large and high-ceilinged, overlooking the park that ran along the back of the ministry. It was lit by a vast and elaborate chandelier. In the darkened windows, beyond the reflection of the electric light bulbs, it was still just possible to make out the shapes of the trees against the evening sky. The junior secretaries had all gone home, their typewriters shrouded for the night, like the cages of sleeping birds. Seated alone in the office at her desk beside the central window was Weizsäcker's senior secretary. She had a cigarette between her scarlet lips and a letter in either hand, and was looking from one document to the other, frowning. "Good evening, my dear Frau Winter." "Good evening, Herr von Hartmann." She bowed her head with equal formality, as if he had paid her a great compliment. "Is he in?" "He's with the minister in the chancellery." "Ah!" Hartmann was taken aback. "In that case, what should I do with Chamberlain's speech?" "He said you were to take it round to him immediately. Wait, what is that on your face?" He stood obediently under the chandelier as she inspected his cheek. Her hair and fingers smelled of perfume and cigarette smoke. He could see strands of grey in her dark curls. He wondered how old she was. 45. Old enough anyway to have had a husband who died in the war. "Ink," she murmured disapprovingly. "Brown ink. Really, Herr von Hartmann, you cannot enter the chancellery looking like that. What if you bump into the Führer?" She drew a white handkerchief from her sleeve, moistened the corner with her tongue, and dabbed gently at his cheek. She stepped back to inspect the result. "Better. I'll telephone to say that you're on your way." Outside, the night was still warm. The pre-war street lamps along the Wilhelmstrasse, set far apart, offered little isolated pools of illumination in the darkness. Hardly anyone was about. In the middle of the street a cleaner was shoveling up piles of horse shit left behind after the parade. The only noise was the scrape of his spade on the asphalt. Hartmann clutched the folder and walked quickly along the façade of the ministry until it came onto the railings of the Reich Chancellery. One of the big iron gates was open. A Mercedes was driving out. The policeman saluted. Hartmann couldn't see who was in the back. As the car headed off in the direction of the Anhalter Bahnhof, he gave his name and department to the policeman and was waved through without a word. Lights were on in the windows all around the courtyard. Here, finally, a sense of activity and crisis. Beneath the canopied main entrance, one of the SS sentries carrying a machine gun asked to see his papers, then nodded him permission to enter the reception hall, where 2 more SS guards were standing, armed with pistols. Yet again he showed his pass and announced that he had come to see State Secretary von Weizsäcker. He was asked to wait. One of the sentries went over to a telephone on a table against the far wall. Hartmann made a mental note. 2 policemen on the gate, 4 SS at least here, and at least another 3 would be in the guardroom. A minute passed. Suddenly the large double doors opened, and a uniformed SS adjutant strode in. His heels clicked and his arms shot out in the Hitler salute, as precise and immaculate as a clockwork soldier. Hartmann returned the obligatory greeting. "Heil Hitler! Follow me, please." They passed through the double doors and across an endless tract of Persian carpet. The room smelled of the Kaiser's time, sun-faded old fabric, dust and beeswax. One could imagine Bismarck stamping across it. Watched by another SS guard. What was that? The 8th? Hartmann followed the adjutant up a marble staircase, past Gobelin tapestries, to the second-floor landing, through a pair of doors, and into what he realized with an accelerating pulse must be the Führer's private apartment. The adjutant said, "May I have that? Wait, please." He took the folder, knocked quietly at the nearest door, and slipped inside. For a moment before it closed, Hartmann heard voices. Then the murmured conversation was cut off. He glanced around. The room was surprisingly modern, tasteful even. Decent paintings, small tables with lamps and bowls of freshly cut flowers. A rug on a polished wooden floor, simple chairs. He was not sure whether he should sit or not. He decided not. Time went on. At one point a handsome woman in a starched white blouse carrying a pile of papers entered the meeting and left almost immediately, empty-handed. Eventually, after a quarter of an hour, the door opened again, and a sleek silver-haired man in his mid-50s emerged, a Nazi party badge in his lapel. This was Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, although in the spirit of these egalitarian days he had dispensed with his title at roughly the same time he acquired the badge. "Thank you for waiting, Hartmann. This is the Führer's reply to Chamberlain. Please take it immediately to the British Embassy and give it either to Sir Neville Henderson or Mr. Kirkpatrick personally." He leaned forward and added confidingly, "Draw their attention to the final sentence. Tell them it's in direct response to tonight's broadcast." And then, more quietly, "And tell them it wasn't easy." "Weizsäcker!" Hartmann recognized Ribbentrop's peremptory voice calling from the room. The barest hint of a grimace flicked across the State Secretary's smooth features, and then he was gone. The British Embassy was less than a 5-minute walk away at the northern end of Wilhelmstrasse, just beyond the Foreign Ministry. As Hartmann waited for the police sentry to open the Chancery Gate, he examined the envelope. It was addressed in Weizsäcker's hand to His Excellency Sir Neville Henderson, Ambassador of Great Britain. It was unsealed. "Good night, sir." The policeman saluted. "Good night." Hartmann walked a little way up the wide street, past the silent, darkening windows of the Foreign Ministry, and then, casually, so casually that if anyone had been watching him they would have thought his behaviour entirely natural, he turned into the main entrance. The night porter recognized him. He mounted the carpeted steps between the stone sphinxes, hesitated, then turned left into the deserted corridor. His footsteps echoed off the stone floor, the lime-green plastered walls, the vaulted ceiling. On either side the doors were closed. About halfway down was a lavatory. He let himself in and turned on the light. His reflection in the mirror above the wash-basins appalled him. Stooped, furtive, in every respect suspicious. He wasn't really cut out for this sort of business. He went into one of the cubicles, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the toilet. "Dear Mr. Chamberlain, I have in the course of conversations once more informed Sir Horace Wilson of my final attitude." There were perhaps 7 paragraphs, some of them long. The gist of it was belligerent, that the Czechs were stalling for time, that their objections to immediate German occupation of the state and land were contrived, and that Prague was working to achieve a general warlike configuration. The final sentence, of which Weizsäcker was so proud, did not strike him as offering much hope for peace. "I must leave it to your judgment whether, in view of these facts, you consider that you should continue your efforts, for which I once more sincerely thank you, of bringing the government in Prague to reason at the very last hour." The typed letter was signed with a scrawled Adolf Hitler. He reached von Weizsäcker's office just as Frau Winter was locking up to go home. She was wearing a fashionable wide-brimmed hat. She stared at him in surprise. "Herr Hartmann? The State Secretary is still at the Chancellery." "Yes, I know. I hate to ask you this, and I wouldn't if it wasn't important." "What?" "Can you copy this, quickly?" He showed her the letter with its signature. Her eyes widened. She glanced up and down the corridor, then turned and unlocked the door and switched on the light. It took her 15 minutes. He kept a lookout in the corridor. She didn't say anything except towards the end. "He seems determined to have a war," she said matter-of-factly, without looking round from her typewriter. and the English are equally determined to avoid one. More's the pity. There, she pulled the last page out of her typewriter. Go. The corridor was still empty. He walked back briskly the way he'd come, and just as he had reached the top flight of stairs leading down to the lobby, he noticed a figure in a black SS uniform heading across the marble floor towards him. Sturmbannführer Sauer of Ribbentrop's private office. He had his head down, and for an instant Hartmann considered turning round, but then Sauer glanced up and recognized him. He frowned in surprise. Hartmann? He was about the same age, with a blank face from which most of the colour seemed to have been drained. White blonde hair, pale skin, pale blue eyes. For want of a better response, Hartmann flung out his arm. Heil Hitler! Sauer responded automatically. Heil Hitler! But then he peered at him. Aren't you supposed to be at the British Embassy? Yes, I'm on my way now. Hartmann descended the last few steps and hurried towards the main entrance. Sauer shouted after him. For God's sake, Hartmann, get a move on! The future of the Reich is at stake. Hartmann was already in the street and striding away from the building. He had a premonition of Sauer running up behind him, challenging him, drawing his pistol, ordering him to turn out his pockets, discovering his notebook. But then he told himself to calm down. He was a third secretary in the English department, responsible among other duties for translation. For him to have a copy of an official letter to the British Prime Minister, a letter that would in any case be in London in less than an hour, was hardly treason. He could talk his way out of it. He could talk his way out of almost anything. He climbed the 5 deeply worn stone steps to the entrance of the British Embassy. The interior of the large portico was lit by a single gloomy lamp. The iron doors were locked. He rang the bell and heard it chime somewhere in the building. The sound died away. Such silence. Along the road, even the Adlon, the most fashionable of all Berlin's guest hotels, was quiet. It was as if the entire city had gone to ground. Eventually he heard bolts being drawn back and a lock turning. A young man poked his head round the door. Hartmann said in English, I have an urgent message from the Reich Chancellery, which I must give either to the ambassador or the first secretary, in person. Of course, we've been expecting you. Hartmann followed him inside, and up a second flight of steps to an imposing reception hall 2 stories high with an oval glass roof. It had been built in the last century by a famous railway tycoon who'd gone bankrupt soon afterwards. The air of opulent bad taste was all-pervasive. Not one but 2 great staircases with porcelain balustrades rose and curled round the opposing walls and met in the middle. Nimbly descending the flight, sideways on, like Fred Astaire, was a tall, slim, dandyish figure in a dinner jacket with a red carnation in his buttonhole. He was smoking a cigarette in a jade holder. Good evening. Herr Hartmann, is it? Good evening, Your Excellency. Yes, it is. I have the Führer's reply to the Prime Minister. Wonderful. The British ambassador took the envelope, quickly pulled out the 3 typewritten pages and started reading them where he stood. His eyes flicked rapidly back and forth. His elongated face, with its drooping moustache, already melancholy in repose, seemed to grow even longer. He grunted under his breath. When he'd finished, he sighed, clamped his cigarette holder back between his teeth, and gazed at the skylight. His cigarette smoke was fragrant, Turkish. The State Secretary wanted you to take particular notice of the last sentence, Sir Neville. He said to tell you it hadn't been easy. Henderson looked again at the last page. Not much of a straw to clutch at, but I suppose it's something. He gave the letter to his young aide. Translate it and telegraph it to London immediately, will you please? No need for cipher. He insisted on showing Hartmann to the door. His manners were as exquisite as his clothes. He was rumoured to be a lover of Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. He had once turned up at the Chancellery wearing a crimson pullover under his pale grey suit. Hitler was said to have gone on about it for days afterwards. What were the British thinking of, Hartmann wondered, sending such a man to deal with the Nazis? At the door he shook Hartmann's hand. Tell Baron von Weizsäcker I appreciate his efforts. He stared along Wilhelmstrasse. Extraordinary to think we may be out of here by the end of the week. I can't say I shall be entirely sorry. He took a final draw of his cigarette, then pinched it delicately between his thumb and forefinger, extracted it from his holder, and flicked it away to disintegrate on the pavement in a cascade of orange sparks. Chapter 5. The Legates lived in a small, rented, terraced house in North Street, Westminster, that had been found for them by Legate's then superior in the Foreign Office Central Department, Ralph Wigram, who lived with his wife and son at the top of the same road. Its advantage was its proximity to the office. Wigram expected his juniors to work hard, and Legate could be at his desk within 10 minutes of leaving his front door. Its disadvantages were almost too numerous to list, and stemmed chiefly from the fact that it was more than 200 years old. Apart from the installation of electricity, little seemed to have been done in all that time. The Thames was barely 100 yards away. The water table was high. Dampness rose from the ground to meet the rain that trickled from the roof. Furniture had to be artfully arranged to hide the patches of blackish-green mould. The kitchen was pre-war, and yet Pamela loved it. Lady Colfax lived in the same street, and in the summer held candlelit dinner parties on the pavement, to which the Legates were invited. It was absurd. He only earned £300 a year. Although they had been obliged to sublet the basement to pay the rent, they still maintained a precarious access to the tiny garden by means of a rickety set of steps from the drawing-room window. Legate had improvised a makeshift lift using a rope and laundry basket to lower the children to play. It was to this once romantic but now essentially impracticable domestic arrangement, symbolic, Legate had come to think of the general state of his marriage, that he found himself hurrying less than an hour after the Prime Minister had finished his broadcast in order to pack an overnight bag. His path took him, as it always did, past the Wigram's house at the top of the street. Most of the flat-fronted houses were blackened by soot, their facades brightened by the occasional window box full of geraniums. Number 4, however, looked blind and abandoned. Behind the small Georgian window panes, the white-panelled shutters had been closed for months. He wished suddenly, with a longing that was almost palpable, that Wigram might still be inside. For it was Wigram more than anyone who predicted this crisis. Obsessively predicted it, if the truth were told, so that even Legate, who had loved him, had thought him half mad on the subject of Hitler. He could call him to mind in an instant. The urgent blue eyes, the fair moustache, the thin taut mouth. But even more than the visual memory, he could hear him, limping along the corridor towards the third secretary's office. First one heavy footstep, and then the sound of his left leg being dragged along behind him, his stick tapping out a warning of his approach. And always the same subject on his lips: Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. When the Germans had reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, Wigram had asked to see the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and had warned him that in his opinion this was the Allies' last chance to stop the Nazis. The PM had replied that if there was only one chance in 100 that an ultimatum might lead to war, he could not risk it. The country would not stand for another conflict so soon after the last one. Wigram had come home to North Street in despair, and had broken down in front of his wife. "Wait now for bombs on this little house." 9 months later, he'd been found dead in his bathroom, aged 46. Whether by his own hand or by some complication of the polio that had crippled him for the past decade, nobody seemed to know. "Oh, Ralph," thought Legate. "Poor dear cracked Ralph. You saw it all." He let himself into his house and turned on the light. Out of habit he called a greeting and waited for a reply, but he could see that they'd all gone, and in a hurry by the look of it. The silk jacket Pamela had worn at lunch was draped over the finial at the foot of the banisters. John's tricycle lay on its side and blocked the passage. He righted it. The stairs cracked and creaked beneath his feet. The wood was rotting. The neighbours complained about the moisture coming through the party wall, and yet Pamela had somehow contrived to make the place chic. A profusion of Persian rugs and crimson damask curtains, peacock and ostrich feathers, beads and antique lace. She had an eye, no doubt, about it. Lady Colfax herself had said so. One night she'd filled the house with scented candles and made it into a fairyland. The next morning the smell of damp was back. He went into their bedroom. Even though the lamp was broken, there was just sufficient light from the landing for him to see what he was doing. Her discarded clothes were heaped up on the bed and strewn across the floor. He had to step over her underwear to reach the bathroom. He packed his razor, shaving brush, soap, toothbrush and tooth powder into his sponge bag, and then returned to the bedroom in search of a shirt. The car was driving slowly down North Street. He could tell by the whine of its engine that it was in a low gear. The glow of its headlights lit up the ceiling, projecting an outline of a window frame across the opposite wall. The dark lines swung like the shadow of a sundial. Leggett paused with his shirt in his hand and listened. The car seemed to have stopped outside with its engine running. He moved to the window. It was a small car, 2 doors, the passengers open. He heard a clatter downstairs. A moment later, a figure in a hat and a dark coat moved smartly away from the house, folded itself back into the car, and pulled the door shut. Leggett was across the bedroom in 2 strides. He took the stairs 3 or 4 at a time, collided with a tricycle, and almost fell full length. By the time he opened the front door, the car was just rounding the corner into Great Peter Street. For a second or two he gazed after it, recovering his breath, then stooped to retrieve the envelope from a doormat. The stationery was heavy, official-looking, legal perhaps. His name was misspelt. Leggatt. He carried it into the sitting room and sat down on the sofa. He worked his finger under the flap and carefully tore it open. He didn't pull the document out immediately. Instead, he parted the envelope with 2 fingers and peered inside. It was his way of preparing himself for bad financial news. He could just make out the typed heading. Berlin, May 30, 1938. OKW, number 42/38G, KDOS, Top Secret Military, LI. It was written in German. Within 10 minutes he was on his way back to the office. Everywhere he looked he detected signs of anxiety. A ruby necklace of taillights stretched all the way down Marsham Street to the petrol station, where motorists were queuing for fuel. A hymn being sung in the open air within the cobbled precincts at Westminster Abbey as part of a candlelit vigil for peace. The silver flare of the newsreel cameras on the blackened walls of Downing Street silhouetting the dark, silent mass of the crowd. He was late. He had to squeeze his way through to get to number 10, his overnight bag lifted high above his head. "Excuse me." But the moment he was inside, he saw his efforts had been wasted. The ground floor was deserted. The ministers had already gone through for the 9:30 meeting of the cabinet. Cleverly was not in his office. Leggett stood for a moment in the corridor and wondered what he should do. He found Sears seated at his desk, smoking a cigarette and staring out of a window. Sears glanced at his reflection in the glass. "Hello, here. Where's Cleverly?" "In the cabinet room, standing by in case they decide to send Horace's telegram to the Czechs." "Is Cadogan with them?" "I haven't seen him." Sears turned round. "You sound a bit overwrought. Are you all right?" "Perfectly." Leggett hoisted his bag to show him. "Just slipped back home to get some things." He left before Sears could ask him anything else. In his office he opened his bag and took out the envelope. It seemed treasonous simply to have brought it into the building. Dangerous to be caught in possession of it. He ought to pass it up the chain of command, get it out of his hands as soon as possible. By 9:45 he was crossing Downing Street, pushing his way more urgently now past the throngs of spectators. And he went through the big iron gate on the opposite side of the road and into the vast quadrangle of ministerial buildings. In each the lights were burning. The Colonial Office in the bottom left-hand corner, the Home Office in the top left, the Indian Office top right, and immediately next to him, up a flight of steps, the Foreign Office. The night porter gave him a nod. The corridor was grand and lofty in the Victorian imperial style, its extravagance calculated to awe those visitors whose misfortune it was not to have been born British. The permanent Under-Secretary's room was on the ground floor corner, overlooking Downing Street on one side and Horse Guards Road on the other. Proximity being the index of power, it was a matter of pride to the Foreign Office that their PUS could be sitting opposite the Prime Minister in the Cabinet Room within 90 seconds of being summoned. Miss Marchant, the senior secretary on duty, was alone in the outer office. She normally worked upstairs for Cadogan's short-sighted deputy, Orme Sargent, universally known as Moley. Leggett was slightly out of breath. "I need to see Sir Alexander. It's very urgent." "I'm afraid he's too busy to see anyone." "Please tell him it's a matter of the gravest national importance." The cliché, like the watch chain and the old-fashioned dark suit, seemed to come naturally to him. He planted his feet apart. Breathless and junior though he was, he would not be shifted. Miss Marchant blinked at him in surprise, hesitated, then tapped softly on the PUS's door. She put her head into the distant room. He could only just hear her. "Mr. Leggett is asking to see you." He says it's extremely important. Yes, I think you should. From the interior came a distinct growl. She stood aside to let him through. As he passed, he gave her a look of such gratitude, she blushed. The hugeness of the room, the ceiling must have been 20 feet high at least, emphasized the smallness of Sir Alexander. He was seated not at his desk, but at the conference table. The surface was almost entirely covered by paper in various colours, white for minutes and telegrams, pale blue for drafts, mauve for dispatches, aquamarine for cabinet papers, interspersed occasionally by brown foolscap files tied with pink ribbon. The permanent Under-Secretary wore a pair of round-lensed tortoiseshell glasses, over the top of which he peered at Leggett with an expression of some irritation. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Sir Alexander, but I thought you ought to see this at once." "Oh, God, now what?" Cadogan reached out, took the 5 typewritten pages, glanced at the first line. "By order of the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces," he translated. He flicked through to the last. "Signed Adolf Hitler. For the accuracy of the transcript, Zietzler, Lieutenant Colonel of the General Staff." And Leggett had the satisfaction of seeing him sit bolt upright in his chair. The document was a directive from Hitler. War on 2 fronts with main effort in the southeast. Strategic concentration green. "Where on earth did you get this?" "It was put through my letterbox at home about 30 minutes ago." "By whom?" "I didn't see them. A man in a car. 2 men, actually." "And there was no message?" "None." Cadogan cleared a space on the table, laid the document in front of him, and bent his disproportionately large head over it. He read with intense concentration, his fists pressed to his temples. His German was good. He had been in charge of the embassy in Vienna in the summer of 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. "It is essential to create a situation within the first 2 or 3 days which demonstrates to enemy states which wish to intervene the hopelessness of the Czech military position. The army formations capable of rapid employment must force the frontier fortifications with speed and energy, and must break very boldly into Czechoslovakia in the certainty that the bulk of the mobile army will be brought up with all possible speed. The main strength of the Luftwaffe is to be employed for a surprise attack against Czechoslovakia. The frontier is to be crossed by aircraft at the same time as it is crossed by the first units of the army." As he finished each page, Cadogan turned it over and placed it neatly to his right. When he reached the end of the document, he squared the pages. "Extraordinary. I suppose the first question we have to ask ourselves is whether it's genuine." "It certainly seems it to me." "Yes, I agree." Permanent Under-Secretary inspected the top page again. "So this was drawn up on the 30th of May. He ran his finger under the German, translating. "It is my unalterable decision to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future." Well, that certainly sounds like Hitler. In fact, it's almost word for word what he said to Horace Wilson this morning. He sat back. "So if we work on the assumption it's genuine, which I think we may, the next questions that arise are essentially threefold. Who gave you this? Why did they give it? And more particularly, why through you?" Once again Leggett experienced a peculiar sensation of guilt, as if merely by possessing the document his loyalty had been compromised. He preferred not to think where it might have come from. "I'm afraid I can't answer any of those. As far as the matter of who gave it to us is concerned, we know there is certainly some sort of opposition to Herr Hitler. Several opponents of the regime have been in contact with us over the summer, claiming they would willingly overthrow the Nazis if we were to guarantee to stand firm over Czechoslovakia. I can't say they're a very coherent group, a few disaffected diplomats and some aristocrats who want to restore the monarchy. This is the first time we've actually received anything specific from them. Not that it tells us much that we don't already know. Hitler wants to destroy Czechoslovakia and do it quickly. That's hardly news." He took off his spectacles and sucked on the stem. He studied Leggett with detachment. "When were you last in Germany?" 6 years ago. "Have you kept in touch with anyone over there?" "No." It had at least the merit of being true. "You were in Vienna, as I recall, after your first attachment to the Central Department, is that right?" "Yes, sir, from 35 to 37. "Friends there?" "Not especially." We had a small child, and my wife was pregnant with our second. We tended to keep to ourselves. What about the German embassy in London? Do you know any of the staff there? No, not really. Then I don't understand. How would the Germans even be aware that you work in number 10? Leggett shrugged. My wife, perhaps? She's in the gossip columns occasionally. Sometimes my name's dragged in. Only the other week the Daily Express, he blushed with shame at the memory, had run an item about one of Lady Colfax's parties, describing him as among the Foreign Office's brightest young stars, now assisting the PM. The gossip columns? The permanent Under-Secretary repeated the term with distaste, as if it was something unspeakable that needed to be handled with a pair of tongs. What on earth might they be? Leggett couldn't tell whether or not he was joking, but before he attempted to answer there was a knock at the door. Come! Miss Marchant was carrying a folder. A telegram from Berlin's just come in. About time. Cadogan practically snatched it from her hand. I've been waiting for this all evening. Once again he laid the document on the table and lowered his large head over it, reading so intently he seemed almost to fall into the page. He muttered under his breath, Bugger, bugger, bugger! Since the crisis started, he'd never left the office before midnight. Leggett wondered how he stood the strain. After a while he stood up. This is the latest from Hitler. The PM needs to see it straight away. Are you going back to number 10? Yes, sir. Cadogan replaced the telegram in the folder and gave it to him. As far as the other business is concerned, I'll put it into the system, see what our people make of it. I'm sure they'll want to talk to you tomorrow. Give the matter some thought. Try to work out who's behind it. Yes, sir. Cadogan reached for another file. According to the Cabinet minutes, telegram 545 from Berlin, letter from the Reich Chancellor to the Prime Minister, was handed to Chamberlain a little after 10 p.m. The Cabinet table was full. 20 ministers in all, not counting Horace Wilson, who was attending in his capacity as special adviser to report on his meeting with Hitler, and the Cabinet Secretary, Edward Bridges, a bespectacled Donish figure whose father had been Poet Laureate. Most were smoking. One of the big sash windows overlooking the garden had been opened in an attempt to disperse the fog of cigars and pipes and cigarettes. A warm night breeze occasionally fluttered the papers that were spread around the table and strewn across the carpet. Lord Halifax was speaking when Leggett entered. He moved discreetly to the Prime Minister's side and laid the telegram in front of him. Chamberlain, who was listening to the Foreign Secretary, glanced at it, nodded in acknowledgment, and gestured with a slight indication of his head that Leggett should go and sit with the other officials in the row of chairs that lined the wall at the far end of the room. Two were occupied by note-takers from the Cabinet Office, both scribbling away. The third, by cleverly. His chin was on his chest, his arms and legs crossed, his right foot twitching slightly. He looked around gloomily as Leggett slipped into the seat next to him. He leaned sideways and whispered, "What was that?" "The reply from Hitler." "What does it say?" "I'm afraid I didn't look." "That was remiss of you. Let's hope it's good news. I'm afraid the poor PM's having rather a sticky time of it." Leggett had a clear sideways view of Chamberlain. He had put on his spectacles and was reading Hitler's letter. He couldn't see the Foreign Secretary, who was sitting opposite the PM, but his voice was unmistakable, with his rolling R's and its tone of confident moral authority, as if he were speaking from some invisible pulpit. "And therefore, with considerable regret, I fear I cannot in good conscience support the Prime Minister on this particular matter. I would feel great difficulty in sending the telegram as drafted by Sir Horace. To tell the Czechs to hand over their territory at once, under the threat of force, would amount, in my opinion, to complete capitulation." He paused to take a sip of water. There was a perceptible tightening in the atmosphere around the table. The holy fox had broken cover. A couple of ministers actually leaned in to make sure they were hearing correctly. "I quite understand that if we don't send Sir Horace's telegram, the consequences may be grievous for millions of people, including our own. It may make war certain, but we cannot urge the Czechs to do what we believe to be wrong, nor do I think the House of Commons would accept it. Finally, and this to me is the crux of the matter, we cannot offer the Czechs any firm guarantee that the German army will content themselves with stopping at the borders of the Sudetenland and will not go on to occupy the entire country. All eyes turned to Chamberlain. In profile, the bushy grey eyebrows and moustache seemed to bristle. a hawk's-beak nose tilted up in defiance. He did not like to be contradicted. Leggett wondered if he might lose his temper. It was not something he'd witnessed. On the rare occasions it did occur, it was said to be spectacular. Instead, though, the Prime Minister said coldly, "The Foreign Secretary has just given us powerful and perhaps even convincing arguments against my proposal. Although it does seem to me to be the last real chance we have." He looked round at the faces of his ministers. "But if that is the general view of colleagues—" He left an expectant pause, like an auctioneer hoping for a final bid. Nobody spoke. "If that is the general view—" Now his voice was harsh in defeat. "I'm prepared to leave it at that." He looked at Horace Wilson. "The telegram will not be sent." Collective shifting in seats and adjustment of papers ensued. The sound of peaceable men girding themselves reluctantly for war. The Prime Minister's voice cut through the murmur. He was not done yet. "Before we proceed further, I should inform the Cabinet that I have just received a reply from Herr Hitler. I believe it might be useful if I were to read it to you now." Several of his more sycophantic ministers, Morm, the Lord Chancellor, Shakes Morrison of Agriculture, said yes and absolutely. The Prime Minister picked up a telegram. "Dear Mr. Chamberlain, I have, in the course of conversations, once more informed Sir Horace Wilson, who brought me your letter of the 26th of September, of my final attitude." It was disconcerting to hear Hitler's commands coming out of Chamberlain's mouth. It made them sound quite reasonable. After all, why should the Czech government object to immediate occupation of territory which they'd already conceded in principle should be transferred to Germany? This represents no more than a security measure which is intended to guarantee a quick and smooth achievement of a final settlement. When they complained about the loss of their border fortifications, surely the world could see they were only stalling for time. If one were to wait for the entry into force of the final settlement in which Czechoslovakia had completed new fortifications in the territory that remained to her, it would doubtless take months and years. And so it went on. It was almost as if Hitler had been given a seat at the cabinet table to make his case. At the end, the Prime Minister took off his spectacles. "Well, that is obviously very carefully drafted, and will require more time to analyse. But it doesn't leave me entirely without hope." Duff Cooper, the First Lord of the Admiralty, piped up at once. "On the contrary, Prime Minister, he hasn't conceded a single point." He was a raffish figure, who always exuded, even in mid-morning, a vague late-night whiff of whisky and cigars, and the perfume of other men's wives. His face was flushed. Leggett couldn't tell whether it was anger or if he'd been drinking. "That may be true," said Halifax, "but it's noticeable he hasn't entirely slammed the door either. He does conclude by inviting the Prime Minister to continue his efforts for peace. Yes, but only in the most lukewarm manner. I leave it to you to decide if it's worth carrying on. He obviously doesn't mean it for a moment. He's just trying to shift the blame for his aggression on the Czechs." "Well, that's not without significance in itself. It suggests even Hitler feels he can't entirely ignore world opinion. It may give you something to work on, Prime Minister." "Now see how the Holy Fox doubles his tracks," thought Leggett. 1 minute for war, and the next for peace. "Thank you, Foreign Secretary." Chamberlain's tone was chilly. Clearly he had not forgiven him. "You all know my convictions. I do intend to go on working for peace until the last possible moment." He glanced over his shoulder at the clock. "Time is drawing on. I need to prepare my statement to Parliament tomorrow. Obviously, I shall have to go further than I did in my broadcast this evening. The House will need to be informed of our warning to Hitler this morning. I suggest we agree collectively on the form of words I should use." He caught Leggett's eye and beckoned him over. In a quiet voice he said, "Would you be so good as to find me a copy of Hitler's speech from last night? Bring it to me after Cabinet." The only version of Hitler's speech that Leggett could lay his hands on was the one published in that morning's Times. He sat at his desk with his own copy and smoothed the pages flat with his palms. Already it seemed an age since he was sitting reading it in the Ritz, awaiting Pamela's arrival. He suddenly remembered he'd promised to call her in the country. He eyed the telephone. It was probably too late now. The children would both be in bed, and doubtless Pamela would have drunk one cocktail too many and had a row with her parents. The awfulness of the day overwhelmed him. The abandoned lunch, the workmen in Green Park, the barrage balloons rising over the Thames, the gas masks for his children, the car pulling away from the curb in North Street. And tomorrow would be worse. Tomorrow the Germans would mobilise and he would be questioned by the Secret Intelligence Service. He would not be able to deflect them as easily as he had Cadogan. They would have his file. He heard voices. It sounded as though the cabinet meeting was over. He stood and crossed to the door. The ministers were emerging into the corridor. Normally after cabinet there was some laughter, a little backslapping, even an occasional argument. There was none of that tonight. Apart from a couple of hushed conversations, most of the politicians put their heads down and hurried out of number 10 alone. He watched the tall, solitary figure of Halifax put on his bowler hat and collect his umbrella from the stand. Through the open door came the now familiar cold white flickering and shouted questions. Leggett waited until he judged the Prime Minister must be alone, then entered the cabinet room. It was deserted. The litter and the overwhelming smell of stale tobacco smoke reminded him of a railway station waiting room. To his left, the door to Cleverley's office was half open. He could hear the Secretary to the Cabinet and the Principal Private Secretary conferring. To his left, the door to Horace Wilson's room was closed. He knocked and heard Wilson call out for him to come in. Wilson was at a side table squirting soda from a siphon into 2 tumblers of what looked like brandy. The Prime Minister was sprawled back in an armchair, legs outstretched, arms dangling over the sides. His eyes were closed. He opened them as Leggett approached. "I'm afraid I could only find the speech in the Times, Prime Minister." "Oh, that's all right. That's where I read it." "God!" With a groan of exhaustion, he hauled himself from the depths of the armchair. His legs moved stiffly. He took the newspaper, placed it open at the speech on Wilson's desk, extracted his spectacles from his breast pocket, and began looking up and down the columns of newsprint. His mouth hung open slightly. Wilson came over from the side table and politely showed Leggett the tumbler. Leggett shook his head. "No, thank you, Sir Horace." Wilson placed it next to the Prime Minister. He looked at Leggett and raised his eyebrows slightly. There was something almost shocking in the complicity of it, the suggestion that they were both having to humour the old man. The Prime Minister said, "This is it. We have never found a single great power in Europe with a man at its head who has as much understanding for the distress of our people as my great friend Benito Mussolini. We shall never forget what he has done in this time, or the attitude of the Italian people. If similar distress should ever befall Italy, I shall go to the German people and ask them to do for the Italians what the Italians have done for us." He pushed the paper across the desk for Wilson to look at. He picked up a tumbler and took a sip. "Do you see what I mean?" "I do. Hitler plainly isn't going to listen to me, but he might well listen to Musso." He sat at the desk, took a sheet of number 10 notepaper and dipped a pen in the inkwell. He paused to take another drink. He gazed ahead in thought, then started to write. After a while he said to Leggett without looking up, "I want you to take this to the Foreign Office cipher room right away and have them telegraph it immediately to Lord Perth at the embassy in Rome." "Yes, Prime Minister." Wilson said, "If you're writing to the ambassador, don't you think you ought to tell the Foreign Office?" "Damn the Foreign Office!" The Prime Minister blotted the wet ink. He turned and smiled up at Leggett. "Please forget you heard that last remark." He held out the letter. "And when you've done that, we'll get to work on my speech to Parliament." A minute later, Leggett was hurrying back across Downing Street towards the Foreign Office. The road was clear, the crowds had gone. Thick cloud over London obscured the stars and moon. An hour remained until midnight.